Today, Nadine Epstein will be speaking about her book written with Ruth Bader Ginsburg on brave and brilliant women, 33 Jewish women to inspire everyone. Please, everyone, keep yourself muted and type in any questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And following today's program, please go to Moment Magazine's website where you can purchase a signed copy of the book. It's in the chat. It's momentmag.com/shop. And to continue on, long introduction. We are fortunate to host Nadine Epstein, who is an award-winning journalist and editor-in-chief of Moment Magazine since 2004, which was co-founded by Nobel Peace Prize recipient Elie Wiesel, whom she edited a tribute book to his life called An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. Nadine is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change and founder of the new Role Model Project created in memory of Justice Ginsburg to help young people identify and select role models. Nadine lives in Washington, D.C., but she's currently on a trip to Florida to keep warm. Just one other thing I wanted to say was, during the last year of Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg's life, she sat down with Nadine Epstein to discuss Jewish women she found inspiring. This book profiles the women RBG identifies and reflects their stories. The trailblazers in this book, like RBG, each fought to forge a better world. And with that, I would like to ask you about your relationship with RBG, Nadine.
Well, I live in Washington, but besides that, what happened is that Justice Ginsburg was a devoted reader of Moment Magazine. And I got to meet her, and I interviewed her a number of times, helped her with some special projects that she was working on. And all of this really culminated in us honoring her in 2019, when we had a special dinner in her honor at the Yale Club in New York. And she spoke there about some of the women who really had sustained her and inspired her throughout her life, Jewish women. And then we presented this beautiful collar to her. And she asked me to bring the collar back to DC and to bring it to her chambers and to give it to her. So I did. And while I was there, and by the way, she wore the collar on the first day of her last term, which was in October 2019. And while I was there, we started talking about women role models, how we each wanted to have role models growing up who were women, and there just weren't enough. And how she was so inspired by Henrietta Sold and by Anne Frank and by other women, but we just touched the surface. And then I started telling her about how when I was a nerdy kid, and I was a very nerdy kid, the kind that read every book in the school library, and I read every biography in the school library. And there were about 350 on the shelf in our little school library. And of those, about 10 were women. And they were the standard women that you would meet: Clara Barton, Molly Pitcher, Amelia Earhart, Madame Curie. There were a few women. There were certainly no Jewish women. And also in my synagogue library, there was really no books about women who had gone off outside the home to change the world and had, there weren't any feminists, real feminists. And I felt really disappointed. And I sort of spent my life searching for women like that. And so had she. And that's how we were just talking. And then because, I'm an editor and a writer, I said something that I say kind of probably every week, every time I get excited about a topic, which is pretty often. I said, well, let's write a book. And she said, in her very simple, blunt way, yes. And there we were. We were suddenly embarking on a journey to write a book together and to try to figure out what that book was.
Can you tell me what it was like to meet with her in her chambers, and what her chambers was like?
Yes. So I really think, by the way, I'm going to preface this by saying that the her chambers were so beautiful. They were she was really had an artistic eye, and she had collected art and photographs and a lot of Jewish art and the colors and paintings and awards that she had won, and everything was just exquisitely presented. And so I really feel like her chambers. So it was like being there with you know the art museum curator who happened to be the justice, Supreme Court justice. But I really feel like we should preserve her chambers. We should have preserved her chambers the way they were exactly, because they just seem to be so special. And just the way we preserve like Julia Child's kitchen in the Smithsonian, I think it would be amazing to do that. I sort of might just, but anyways, it was so beautiful. She was always a very gracious host in her chambers. And she was very proud of her Jewish art that she had. And this, which brings me back to the book. So we talked about, why just Jewish women? There are so many amazing women that inspired her, who were brilliant women. Polly Murray, who's the African-American woman who really kind of paved the way for a lot of her work, Justice Ginsburg's work in the 14th Amendment. There's just amazing, Frances Perkins, there's just so many amazing women. But the Jewish women became, because this book was part of her Jewish journey. I didn't really quite realize that at the time. But Justice Ginsburg grew up, attended a conservative synagogue in New York. She went to Hebrew school. She was a very good student. She absorbed all her Torah lessons as she learned the prayers. And then when she was 16 and her mom died the day before she graduated from high school, she wanted to say prayers as part of the minyan, and she was not allowed to. And as a result, during that Shiva sent her away from what was traditional Judaism at the time, a traditional patriarchal Judaism. And what became her Judaism were the principles and the beliefs that she had absorbed from Deborah, from reading the Torah, studying in Hebrew school, but also the Jewish women who she admired, Jewish women, learning about Jewish women of history and in the Bible became her Judaism for decades. And then suddenly Judaism caught up with her. Sometime in, I can't remember when, but about 10, 12 years ago, she had a clerk, and that clerk had a wife who was a rabbi at one of the major conservative synagogue in Washington, D.C. And Justice Ginsburg was so excited that there was a woman rabbi there. And so that brought her back into the fold. Judaism had caught up with Justice Ginsburg. And she started occasionally attending High Holy Days services at Adas Israel. So she could become part of the sort of more traditional aspects of religion, which she hadn't been able to participate in for years. So this book, we had no idea, of course, it's the last year of her life. We're just talking. This is like she's very busy, I'm super busy. This is like an extra project for both of us, and certainly for her. But she cares so much about these women, about these Jewish women, that she wants to share their legacy. She wants to share their stories with everyone. And she really, in a way, she wants them to be part of her legacy.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the process of writing this book with her?
Well, she was very busy. I was very busy. Like I said, it wasn't a project either of us really had quote unquote time for, but we were both dedicated to it. First, we had to decide what women would be in the book. The goal was, by the way, 36 women, not 33 women. but for a variety of reasons, a few women came out, and we ran out of time. So, but she had so many suggestions of people. She just started throwing out names, and I'm like writing them down. And then basically I went back and did some research, and we came up with 150 women who we would like to be in the book. And some of those women were alive, like Gloria Steinem. And somehow, as we went through this whole process, it seemed like it was kind of odd to have Gloria Steinem and then have all these other women who were of the past or of the Bible. So even after we had decided on the first round, the women, she was still sending me more names of women. So it was quite a process. We ended up deciding on really the women that she cared the most about. And then I added some women that I cared the most about, and that I thought rounded out the book. I learned about her women. I hadn't heard of a lot of her women, and she learned about my women. But you asked how it was to write the book. Well, this turned out to be COVID era, and she was locked down, and I was pretty locked down. So most of the book we did by email conversations. And then when I did a first draft, she wrote the introduction, and we discussed the whole book and chose the woman, but she wanted to read every single word of all the biographies. So she read the first draft of every biography, and she had a lot of opinions. She was a very, she was a very active editor. She took my draft and she marked it up. And she said, I don't use this word. I don't agree with you on this point. And I realized afterwards that it was like as if I was a law clerk, one of her law clerks. At first, when I saw it, I was like, because when we agreed to do the book, she told me, well, I know working with you will be wonderful. I love your work. You're such a professional. I love your writing is so good. And then I gave her this first draft, and she had just pages. I mean, just every page was marked. And first, I have to say, I was like, oh my God, I felt ashamed. Like, first of all, I had very little time to write it, regardless. But anyways, I felt like embarrassed. I had disappointed her. But then I realized that that's how she edited people. It wasn't just me. And two, I got to learn from every single edit that she made. I learned something about Justice Ginsburg, and that's incredibly valuable.
I wanted to ask you about why she chose women of the Haggadah and women of the Bible. And that kind of surprised me. But then when I read it, I completely understood, but I'd like to hear you talk about it.
Well, when we're sitting in her chambers in October 2019, having this initial conversation about the book, the first women that she says, oh, and we have to have the women of Haggadah. And I was like, why? And then she goes, oh, and it has to be Miriam's mother, the midwives, and Pharaoh's daughter. And I was like, the midwives, Pharaoh's daughter? I'm not even sure Pharaoh's daughter was Jewish. As it turns out, according to Midrash, she did marry a Jew and then leave Egypt with the Israelites. But I had no idea. I didn't know that at the time. And she goes, it doesn't matter if she's Jewish or not. These are the women who ensured the survival of Judaism. They ensured the survival of Moses. Without these women, there would be no Judaism. And they don't get enough credit. And I didn't learn about them enough when I was a kid. And they weren't in the Haggadah. They're not in the Haggadah. And they're not at the Seder table and conversations. We have to have these women in the book. So we did. And also, of course, Deborah. We had to have Deborah in the book too. And that's because, of course, Deborah really was an influence on her in being a judge. That was a much more direct influence that I could understand. So that's how we got these women. It was actually the hardest part for me to write, because while I love history and write about history, and I'm, of course, a journalist, I'm not a rabbi, and I don't, or a rabbinical, or a scholar, and I don't do midrash. So my first draft of them, when I sent her all the drafts of the story, she put a big X next to them, go, these are the weakest ones. And it's true. They were the weakest ones. And I did work with Rabbi Holtzblatt at Addis, who was her friend, and also with Moment's very brilliant books and opinion editor, Amy E. Schwartz. And they read them for me, and they explained to me, they taught me how I could do this, and I could do it. So, but it was a learning curve.
Thank you. So I also wanted to know who the other women are that she most admired. If you can talk a little bit about that.
So I'll tell you some of her favorite women. I mean, she really liked Rebecca Gratz. She adored Fanny Mendelssohn. Fanny Mendelssohn is in the 19th century. She's a pianist and composer. She's a genius, and she's completely overshadowed by her brother Felix Mendelssohn. I would have never thought of putting her in this book, but Justice Ginsburg was loved music. Was very knowledgeable about music, and especially opera singing, but all music. And she felt Felix Mendelssohn had completely overshadowed and taken advantage of his sister, and Fanny just deserved attention. So Fanny was in the book. She loved Emma Lazarus. That Emma Lazarus, again, was one of her kind of the women, Emma Lazarus, Henrietta Zold, Lillian Wall. These are women who meant a lot to her. She wanted to have Golda Meir in the book, although I think that we both realized that Golda Meir wasn't really a feminist, but she definitely did something amazing that most women didn't do. Let's see what other ones she loved. Oh, Rita Levi-Montalcini. She had met Rita Levi-Montalcini. She's wins a Nobel Prize in medicine. And this is a woman who not only has to deal, like many of these women, not only do they have to deal with gender discrimination, she's living in Italy during Mussolini era. She's running for her life. And everywhere she hides, she sets up a laboratory to work on her work. She's an amazing woman. And Justice Ginsburg had met her. Bessie Margolin. Bessie Margolin is an amazing woman. This is a woman, she's orphaned at a young age. She goes to an orphanage at a young age in New Orleans. She ends up graduating. It's a Jewish orphanage. It happens to be a fabulous orphanage. She ends up getting a great education, graduating top of her class at Tulane Law School, going to Yale on a fellowship, and she can't get a job anywhere. She can't get a job as a lawyer except at the federal government. Eventually, she ends up working on the equal pay right for women, and she works for the federal government. And she's really pushes amazing things that we would, we all value today. There's Bella Abzig. We both loved Muriel Faye Siebert. It happens to be the only woman, she's the only woman in the book who we both met. Justice Ginsburg had the opportunity to meet many amazing women. Most of these women were long gone before I came on the scene, but I happened to be, I don't know, like maybe 19 or something. And I was on a train from New York to Philadelphia, and there was an empty seat next to me. And Muriel Faye Siebert sat next to me on a train the day she had been in a helicopter crash, and everyone had survived, but she didn't want to fly home. So wherever she was going, she had decided to take the train and just sat next to me and told me her story. And she was so amazing. And she, of course, gave me her business card at the end and said, "Hey, call me." But I didn't really have the capacity at that point to like value that as something special. I was like, yeah, sure, but I never really did. And then Roberta Peters. Oh my gosh, Justice Ginsburg loved Roberta Peters, who was an opera singer who she had seen at the Met. And then, of course, I forgot Gertrude Berg. Gertrude Berg created and played Molly Goldberg on radio. Justice Ginsburg grew up listening to Molly Goldberg's show on radio with her family before it was even on TV. And she was so inspired by this woman. This woman, she really was. She wrote the show herself. It was her idea. She was the star of it. She produced it, and she owned the rights to it. She was the role model to like Lucille Ball, who then created her own whole media empire. Well, Gertrude Berg did that too. And one of the things that really stuck with Justice Ginsburg is that Gertrude Berg worked and supported her husband and family at a time when women were afraid. Women didn't do that because it looked bad for their husband, on their husbands. It reflected badly on their husbands. And even at a young age, she thought that was ridiculous. And so she thought Gertrude Berg was just amazing. So those were some of the women that she added. I added some other women who I think were really important. Salome Alexandra. I mean, this is an amazing woman who is a queen, one of the few queens of Israel. And this is a Judea. She's the queen of Judea. She's not only so one of the problems about writing about women in history is that there's very little documentation, and there's historians just didn't write about women, and women weren't historians, and women didn't write their stories. But Queen Salome came to the notice of Flavius Josephus, who was a Greek historian, and he wrote about what an amazing leader she was and how she kept this country together and how it flourished under her time, under her rule. Shortly after, when she died, her two sons got into, battled each other, and the kingdom fell. She also, not realizing that this was going to happen, set the stage for rabbinical Judaism, which ensured the survival of Judaism again. So I just think she's incredibly important, as is Gracia Mendez Masti. This is a woman who was a shipping magnate in her era. She was one of the richest people in the world, at a time where women didn't run businesses and weren't even allowed to run businesses, but she did. And she used her power to bring Jews out of Spain and Portugal to help Jews survive, get out of the Inquisition, get away from the Inquisition. And she helped resettle them in Italy and then in the Ottoman Empire. And she even, way before Herzl, created the first Jewish homeland in Israel, Palestine. She makes a deal with the Ottoman Sultan, and she and her family rebuild Tiberias and bring Jews who are escaping the Inquisition there so they can be safe. Now this project, after she dies and after the Sultan dies, the project evaporates. But for a while, it was a big success. I mean, we don't talk about that at all. There's Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose, what an amazing woman. So Ernestine Rose should be on all Americans should know about her. This is a woman who's born in Poland to a very strict traditional rabbi. She's the only child. Her mom dies when she's 16. I was thinking about this 16 and the 16 with Justice Ginsburg the other night. And her father is going to marry her off to somebody she doesn't know, doesn't want to marry, and she inherits a portion from her mom and gives that money to the guy he's going to betroth her to. She goes to civil court in the next town by herself, is her own lawyer, and wins this case. She gains her freedom and she gains her money. Gives most of the money back to her dad, and then leaves and becomes an entrepreneur throughout Europe. She marries in England eventually for love. She comes to the United States, and she's one of the founding mothers, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, of the American suffragist movement. And she's really amazing. Talk about intersectionality. So she was one of the suffragists and she was a fiery speaker. She was so famous in her time. But she believes that you cannot give women rights without giving slaves their rights. And this is, of course, a rift within the suffragist movement. She eventually is not on the winning side, but strategically, perhaps that was the way things had to go. But she's really unknown in the United States, even though she was really one of the major players. And part of that, some people say because she was Jewish, even though she wasn't religious, she had really rebelled against Judaism. Although she really defended Jews because there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time. She spoke out against anti-Semitism. Also, she moved to England later on and died in England. But in any case, she was an amazing woman. Emmy Nether is a German woman, German Jewish woman who is actually, girls aren't even allowed to study math, and she's not allowed to go to university, but she does somehow. She gets a PhD. She can't get a job. She eventually gets a job and goes to Göttingen University to teach mathematics, gets there, and the job is rescinded. She's only allowed to teach under the name of male professors. And she gets no pay, no salary. And she persists, and she becomes a really successful mathematician. And Einstein calls her a genius for her work in developing higher algebra. And she also suffers from incredible discriminating anti-Semitism, and eventually ends up fleeing Germany, and then gets a real job finally for the last few years of her life, which was unfortunately very short, at Bryn Mawr. But this is like an amazing woman we don't hear anything about. So those are just some of my favorite. Florence Prague-Kahn. She was the first Jewish woman in Congress. She was there for 5 terms. Her husband was there for 12 terms, and then he died, and she was there for 5 terms. She was an amazingly respected leader. She was a Republican. She was a woman who brought military bases to San Francisco, helped build the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge. I mean, these are, again, we don't hear about these women. So there's just so many. So those are just some. Oh, Rosalind Franklin. Oh my gosh, she's amazing. So, I mean, I could go on and on. But there are a lot of those.
I had a question. Did you mention Lillian Ward and the Henry
Lillian
Street
Wald.
settlement?
Lillian Wald.
Wald.
Yes, definitely one of the ones that came up in the first conversation while we were sitting in chambers. Lillian Wald actually went to the only medical school that women were allowed to go to, or women could attend, which was a brand new medical school in New York. Stayed there for a year and then discovered the incredible poverty among immigrants, a lot of them Jewish from East Europe, who were just like Emma Lazarus discovered them as well. And she saw how little health care they had. And so she left medical school and devoted herself to like creating public health. She was the pioneer of public health. And an amazing woman. And the settlement house is still there today.
The Henry Street settlement.
Henry Street settlement is still there. Yeah.
Which I didn't know was started by a Jewish woman. So.
Yeah. And Rebecca Gratz started a lot of these organizations, these like orphanages and Sunday schools. She started these. Her starting. She's created secular ones and Jewish ones in Philadelphia, right after the United States becomes a country. And that becomes the model for all over the country, all over, I mean, for women all over the nation. They start doing this. She's Jewish, but it doesn't matter. They're doing it for all church groups and all religious groups, or start doing the same thing.
One person that's a little more recent is Jewish, Judith Resnick. I thought her story was very interesting.
Well, I happen to have been a very, very young reporter when I covered the Challenger explosion. And so her name has always stayed in my mind. And she happened to be a woman who was just as NASA was beginning to like consider including women. She was just the right age. And she was this brilliant woman who was a musician who was planning to go to Juilliard and then who got into Juilliard, but also happened to get a perfect SAT score and made a detour and instead became an engineer and led to her whole career as an astronaut. So she's like an amazing woman, really.
Well, then we have some questions that have come up. So let me, and anybody who would like to add questions in the chat, please do.
Well, there's one thing I like to
Oh,
say,
yes, please.
which is, well, I want to talk about role models a little bit, because role models are really important. And Justice Ginsburg and I talked about role models. What's a role model? How I define role model is that you see somebody that you has a quality or trait that you can identify, that you admire, and that you want to incorporate into yourself. It's not that you want to like become somebody else. It's not that you want to worship that person. It's not that you want to join their cult. It's because you see one quality or two qualities that you can absorb. And the idea is to have a whole range of people that you can choose qualities from and bring them into yourself. And I think it's a process that we go through first as kids, although not consciously. And that's one of the reasons for the Role Model Project, is help people maybe think about this a little more consciously when they're in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and they're still just coming out into the world and thinking about the world, but also at all ages, at our ages, in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 100s, you're still growing, you're still incorporating just what's important to you. So I want to say that in the process of doing this, getting to know Justice Ginsburg, she definitely became one of my role models. There were a couple things that I absorbed from her, that I observed in her, that I think are really important to my development as a person. One, a long time ago, I was in her office and we were talking about Supreme Court justices, how many were women. And she was saying, she believed, as I do, that having more women in the room changed the tone of the conversation, and that we needed more women in the room. And I said something like, well, it would be great if we had half the court was women. And she looked at me and said, why half? For centuries, but all men. Nobody made a fuss about that. Why should anybody make a fuss if it's all women? And I went, oh. So what I learned from that was, well, my expectations really weren't high enough. And I need to have higher expectations. Another thing I learned from her is I saw how dedicated she was to this project. I mean, how hard she just worked on everything. And I'm a very persistent person, but I realized that there was a level of persistence and perseverance that was above what I had, and that I could learn, I could do better. And then the last thing that I learned came from a conversation I had with her where we were sitting in her chambers, and I said something like, I like being a journalist because I'm behind the scenes and I don't really have to get out there and put myself out there and be up on stage and say what I think. And she said, get over it. She said, just like that, get over it. And I kind of looked at her and she said, if you do not speak your mind, no one will speak it for you. And there was something about the way she said that, and something about having her be the person saying it to me that really struck me. And I went out and started I took some public speaking classes, and I took musical theater, and I started singing, and I took an improv class, and I took a stand-up comedy class and did a show. And I forced myself to go out there to start speaking my mind. And I want to say that these are lessons that all of us at any age need to learn. And because we're not going to have true gender equality in this country, maybe any kind of equality, but certainly gender equality, until we have more women in positions of power in all fields. We are not going to be getting a new ERA until we have a majority of women in Congress. These things just aren't going to happen. It's not going to be a value. And we really have to all step up. And it's not just for women, by the way. This book is not just for girls or for women, because it's not written down for kids. It's for everyone. It's for boys and for men too. And the kinds of leaders we need male leaders who value some of the same traits that women bring to leadership, the ability to listen, the ability to find consensus, the ability to think strategically, which is what Justice Ginsburg did. The ability to not, and this, a lot of this is in the end of the book, is we have a call to action, not just to argue with people for argument's sake. In a world like today, where our world is so polarized, when was the last time you had an argument with someone about politics or the world where you changed someone's mind? I don't think that's how we change people's minds. We change people's minds by building trust incrementally. We change people's minds by, well, you know, Justice Ginsburg had a friendship with Justice Scalia. This was not a friendship based on their worldviews, which probably couldn't have been more different. But they found some things to bond over and to gain trust over, and they valued each other. And we all have to do that. So we have to step up. We have to, all of you have to run for office, and not just in women's organizations. And we all have to get out there, and we have to be building trust. And I think those are very important messages that are in this book for all ages.
Thank you so much. Those words, your words and her words, are truly inspirational. I wanted to get to some of our questions because there's quite a few in the chat. So let's start with, somebody said, I'm not Jewish, so I appreciate you explaining that. And I think that gets back to the Jewish values that were behind her thinking and her role models.
Yes, so I think that comment came up when I mentioned the word tzedek, but Justice Ginsburg was very much from the school of, in Judaism, of justice, that, you know, we are bending the arc towards justice. And she was, you know, so she was definitely from the school of social justice within Judaism, which is a very powerful movement within Judaism, among many other movements within Judaism. So
we have another question about your research. Where did you get the research on these women that so many people have never heard of, particularly the people more back in history?
It was really hard, actually. I thought this was going to be a lot easier project. There are books about some of these women. The Jewish Women Archives has really good material, and it's a great resource. Some I had to actually interview some experts and work with, because I just didn't know anything about them. And also there was just so much information about them. How do you know what's the most important? And in one case, actually, Justice Ginsburg and I disagreed about the importance of one woman, and that was Betty Friedan. We both thought Betty Friedan should be in the book, but when I wrote my first draft and did my research and talked to different people, I felt like she was much more important I felt like she was really central to how women of that era saw themselves, with her book, The Feminine Mystique. And as it turns out, Justice Ginsburg felt that she wasn't as important, particularly because to women of color, urban women, and really the difference, it took me a while to understand why we disagreed, but I grew up in the suburbs, and my mother, who was an amazing leader and a brilliant woman, gave up everything to move to the suburbs from New York City, get married and have 4 children. And my memory of her was very unhappily being surrounded by piles of laundry. I mean, she loved being a mom, but she wanted to be out there in the world. She was born to be out there in the world. In a different era, my mom would have been senator from New Jersey, but my mother was the president of AAUW and the president of Hadassah. But in any case, she ran study groups at our house for AAUW, American Association for University Women. And the women read Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. And it was sitting on our bookshelf for as long as I could remember. And being that nerdy kid, I read it at a very young age. I said, wow, this is my mom and this is every woman I know. So from my perspective, Betty Friedan was more revolutionary than to Justice Ginsburg. And of course, Justice Ginsburg grew up in New York, went to Harvard, lived in Boston, then lived in New York City, then lived in Washington, D.C. And although she spent 2 years in Mississippi, she was a very urban woman. She never had to give up her career. And she also married the most amazing guy of her era, Marty Ginsburg, who was totally happy to support, not only just support her, but just to advocate for her, and who was delighted to cook all the food and dinner, and was a great cook. And she just lived in a different world. So that was where I began to understand how, it's not just what you're researching, but it's what you're coming out, the conclusions that you're drawing about people. And that was hard to sometimes know, because I'm not a scholar about every single, I'm not, a scholar writing books about on any of these women. I'm writing about the world. I'm editor of a magazine. I mean, I write books about all sorts of things, but I'm not a scholar, a scholar of like great feminists. So that was the hardest part.
Mhm. We have another question. Did you get to meet the other female justices, and did RBG ask for input into the book, their input into the book?
The answer is, I don't think that she did. I think, remember, this book is taking place in what ends up being the last year of her life. So we really had this conversation in October. It took us quite a few months to decide on what women should be in the book. We also had to I had to write a book proposal and send it off. I really didn't start the book. I started researching, but I didn't really start writing until July. She dies in September. We don't know she's going to die. She's in a very big rush to see the book because she's concerned. She has such a busy schedule, and she always did her homework, and she wanted to prepare. She needed to have August to prepare for her court, for the court. And so there was almost, so I wrote a draft quickly so that I could give this to her. I don't think there was any time for her to show this to anyone. I showed it to lots and lots of people. I talked to all sorts of scholars. I had different sections read by different scholars or different people who knew about them. I also had some young readers and some older readers, all sorts of readers. So I did all the showing. I don't think she showed it to anyone that I know of, except her staff.
Mm-hmm. And the next question is, did she ever express concern regarding the future of the Supreme Court?
She very much wanted there to be more women on the Supreme Court. She definitely had not liked that period where she was the only woman on the Supreme Court. She was definitely talked down to by the men, and her opinions were not taken seriously. She had the same experience that so many other women have had. 20 minutes into the meeting, you come up with, hey, here's what we should do. Here's our idea. Here's my idea. Nobody hears it. And then 20 minutes later, the man says it. It's the idea everyone wants. So she had that kind of experience a lot. I think she was very concerned about the trajectory of the country at that point. And I don't think she thought she would be dying so soon and changing the trajectory of the Supreme Court in our era.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to say or tell us before we get to our final information?
Sure. I was going to tell you that in my day job, I'm editor-in-chief of this fantastic magazine. If you haven't seen it, it's called Moment Magazine. And it's an independent magazine, has all sorts of culture, arts, politics, And you can go to momentmag.com and learn about it and subscribe. Like we do all sorts of things. Like this is a wonderful project here where we came up with the soundtrack of the Jewish people, where we have like amazing music. We also published we didn't publish this book. This is a partnership with Random House, but we do have our published books as well. Oh, and I see Jerry has some.
Well, guess what? We get Moment Magazine at this JCC, and we put every copy into our library. So people are welcome to come and sit in our library and enjoy this. So
But you can also subscribe and support us. We're a nonprofit, and it's I mean, it's less than $20 to subscribe for a year. And also we have incredible programming every Tuesday at 4:30. Like we are like the 92nd Street Y, or like the Screwball Center, or like you, that we offer programming every Tuesday of amazing writers and singers and musicians and artists. Here's one, actually, we did something on the jokes issue, and which is just like everyone's, like, what you can learn about Jews from like the jokes, and these are just some people's favorite jokes. But I just want to point out, this reminded me that Justice Ginsburg really wanted us to do a story on the Israeli Supreme Court. She was really concerned about the Israeli Supreme Court and how it was basically had become like this political football. And she actually suggested that we do a story. And in this same issue is a story called The Battle Over the Supreme Court. And it's a really good story showing the different points of view. Again, moments like we have to understand all points of view. We can't just, this is not opinion journalism. This is like, so that story explains why there are many people in Israel who support what the Supreme Court does, and there are other people who would like to dismantle the power of the Supreme Court. So I think it's a very fair story, and we did that story, well, Justice Ginsburg really asked me to. We also have books that we publish, which is like this wonderful book, I Got a Cartoon for You, the Moment Magazine Book of Jewish Cartoons by Bob Meinkoff, and who was the cartoon editor at the New Yorker, and he's my friend, and we did this book together, and Roz Chast wrote the foreword, and it's wonderful. And then here's another wonderful book we did, Can Robots Be Jewish? And other pressing questions of modern life. Again, Amy Schwartz, who I mentioned, she's just brilliant. We have this column called Ask the Rabbis, where we talk to rabbis of the widest spectrum of rabbis we can find. Orthodox, super Orthodox, not, humanist, no denomination, and all those in between. And it's really a fascinating project. And so in this book, we collected some of those here, and it's really funny, and it's got great illustrations. It's really, everything we do is beautifully designed. We really work hard. So
we have some subscribers on this to Moment
That's
Magazine.
Wonderful. That's great.
Yes.
Well,
and also we had another question come in.
Oh, sure.
Attend her RBG's funeral?
So I did not. This was COVID era, and it was a very small gathering, and I was not part of that. I did have. There was another kind of gather. There was she was her coffin was laid out at the Supreme Court, and so her other friends who couldn't all go to the funeral went there. So I did have a chance to do a kind of private goodbye, but it was anyway. But the most amazing thing was the outpouring of people and the flowers and the comments and it was around the Supreme Court at that time. It was just very, very moving. I did not know she was going to be dying then and there. All my correspondence with her gave me the feeling that she had, she was planning on being there. I knew the cancer had come back and that she was staving off cancer. But while she was staving off cancer, by the way, she was working on this book. and many other things, but that's really an incredible testament to her.
Yes, work till the very end.
Yes.
And the whole nation mourned.
And we interviewed her even, I think, in this yes, so this is in this book, this issue that you pulled up is like the September-October issue of 2019. She's in it because also right before she dies, I don't know if she's going to die, I asked her to participate in this. And so I didn't hear from her directly, but her office sent me her statement and she's in there, which is, so again, I did not realize that she was going to be leaving us so soon.